Hi, I'm Al Kresta, President and CEO of Ave Maria Radio and host of Kresta in the Afternoon. Thanks for joining me and my guests. We're going to be examining a troubling, controversial, and much misunderstood topic, but one that Christians in particular should be fashioning a proper response to. It's the problem of wokeness, and of course we'll define it. But let me give you some examples so you can form an idea. When President Trump was elected in 2016, the students at the University of Michigan petitioned the administration to fund and establish safe spaces where those who were especially troubled by the election of President Trump could take refuge. These were students who felt that they were no longer in a safe country, that their voices were not being heard.
Donald J. Trump is now president of the
just because the 2016 election didn't go their way. Over the last generation, a new vocabulary has emerged to describe concepts that are fundamental to wokeness: cisgender, gender dysphoria, gender incongruence, non-binary, transitioning, gender assigned at birth. And they join older concepts like critical race theory, white privilege, systemic racism, and patriarchy. These are markers of deep and systemic injustice in American culture. And we're told by some academics and left-wing activists that America owes its wealth to the history of slavery. We're told that the human race is no longer differentiated by male and female, but by dozens of genders. In fact, there are those that would claim that gender has no connection to biological sex whatsoever, and that the concept of gender is entirely malleable. Some people are claiming new sensitivities to issues of race and gender, claiming, for instance, that Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie books present stereotypical views of gender that are damaging to young people. In fact, her name was pulled from a library award because of the stereotypical form of her attitudes. And in Seattle, we're told that a proper sensitivity to race issues requires us to stop referring to brown bag lunches and rather say sack lunches. When the Oakland, California Police Department sent out a message not to have too many margaritas during Cinco de Mayo, they were accused of being racist and biased against Latinos. And University of Connecticut, in my home state of Connecticut, offers mental health counseling after conservative commentators like Ben Shapiro come on campus. In Vermont, a school has decided that fifth grade instructors on human reproduction must replace the use of boy and girl by persons who produce sperm and persons who produce eggs. Thankfully, there are books that are analyzing these trends, like The Coddling of the American Mind, The Diversity Delusion, The Canceling of the American Mind. And today, we speak with a woman who's given us one of the sharpest books in this whole field, and that's Noelle Mering, author of Awake, Not Woke. We have with us today, though, a woman who's written what I think is one of the keenest books in this whole field, and that's Noelle Mering. She's the author of Awake, Not Woke, a Christian response to the cult of progressive ideology. She's a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She's co-author with Carrie Gress of the Theology of Home series. You can visit her at noellemering.com, and we'll have all that information for you, of course, at the website. I'm also joined by Peter Herbeck, Executive Vice President of Renewal Ministries, Director of Mission there, and this is part of a series that Renewal Ministries and Ave Maria Radio have been engaging in, various topics of concern and interest. Noelle, good to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Peter, of course, good to be with you again.
Excellent. Really happy to be here.
Let's go over. I gave a number of examples of wokeness in our culture. Any examples that you want to give that you think might flesh it out even better?
I thought it was striking a couple years ago when Dr. Seuss was canceled. I don't know if you remember that. Because, of course, I think what was happening there is that he's such a beloved author, and so many people associate him with positive childhood memories.
Yeah.
That I think targeting him in some ways is a efficient way to make us sort of question what we know to be okay and acceptable at all.
Very good.
If someone so understandably wholesome in our imaginations is now verboten and not to be celebrated, then what else are we missing? And I think this is part of the poison of the movement, is that it really makes you uncertain of what you think, what you believe, what you know to be true. And so you need sort of a woke shepherd to kind of guide you into the wisdom of the ideology because it's too fraught. There's too many landmines.
Yeah.
It makes us unable to feel confidence in our ability to access truth at all.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah,
Peter?
I just in a general way, seeing how many people, whether it's in the business world or just socially, are kind of off balance, not knowing what they can say, what we can't say, fear of being canceled, and it's a kind of potent reality that a lot of people are, hiding from or not knowing how to respond to, and kind of paralyzed, I think, at times. And so it's kind of all over the place.
It
You'd
is.
think it was limited maybe to academia or something
Right.
like that, but it's everywhere now.
Let me take this a little further. The trade publication Education Week reported that about 500 school districts around the country are rating teacher applicants according to their, quote, cultural competency, which is a code for wokeness. Many of these districts are contracting with a teacher hiring company called Nimble, which uses artificial intelligence to examine applications and interview answers to determine which candidates harbor the correct political and cultural attitudes. There have been a number of instances where it became clear that Christians were not desirable candidates for teaching positions. I remember when this stuff started happening, it seemed amusing. It seemed like these people are crazy. They're overly sensitive. What's wrong? But now it's become really a dangerous movement within our culture. It's affected the academy. It's affected areas of the church. It's affected the business world, which is really shocking that corporate executives would find it valuable to engage in these exercises. Let me go though back to some of the basics here, which is definition. So you've written the book on it. So how do you define wokeness?
I think to be woke is to be aware of the systemic oppression all around you. So it's a raising of the consciousness, which also stems from Marxism, to see in all institutions, relationships, even in our families, in our marriages, in our neighbor's barbecue, that all of these institutions, places, relationships are all contests for power. So it creates a filter of power through which we look at everything in our lives. And I do think it's fundamentally founded on changing the identity of the person to two different types of oppression. One is we are oppressed from groups outside of ourselves, sort of the identity politics, where we're defined into division as oppressor or oppressed. And two, we're defined by the oppression of the moral law and having to fight against our own internalized repression that makes us sort of conform to traditional sexual mores, for example. And so part of our freedom becomes the ability to be transgressive. So I think it's fundamentally those two things, that we're seeking freedom through a dictatorship of the proletariat, from the oppressors rising up and dismantling systems, and also from becoming increasingly transgressive as a society.
It's important. The idea of transgressive, this is now considered a virtue, where you violate some boundary which is meant to reestablish the power relationships, if I understand it correctly.
That's right.
Is that
Every
right?
transgressive act is a flag planted for liberty.
Yes,
It's
okay.
progress.
Okay,
Yeah.
and it's worth pointing out too that this internal oppression that we feel from the moral law or the natural law, the champions of wokeness don't believe in moral law
Right.
or natural law. So to them, those are just psychological impediments that have been imposed on you by your parents or the church or some external agent.
That's right. That's right. It's a social construct, and it's been unjustly oppressing us for all these generations.
Yeah.
And that it was intended in the first place to manipulate people
Yeah.
to gain power, right? So it's always, everything is viewed past and present by that optic of all relations are relations of power.
Yeah.
Every moral claim behind it is
Yes.
powerful people willing an end that they want. They want control, and so they set up a moral structure that they pretend is somehow universal or natural or God-given, and everybody should see it and do it, that kind of thing. So they're trying to undermine it all by just calling it. It's amazing how quickly the natural law has sort of disappeared from the conversation, as well as the commandments of God and all that. It's all been reduced so quickly in our culture.
Yeah.
And after so many years of understanding it and living by it, and it's not such an easy thing to dismiss in life, but they're doing it. They're making great strides in doing it.
Yeah.
the claim is that if any claim to truth is actually a claim to power.
Right.
That truth is simply the complement that you pay to tactics that get you power over other people.
Yeah, that's right.
yeah.
Objectivity is considered to be a white supremacy aligned virtue.
Yeah.
Because there is no actual objectivity. As Peter was saying, that's a perpetuation of a hegemonic system that we have to dismantle.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go to the theological foundation, which you lead off. Your first chapter deals with the fall, deals with the temptation in the garden, that you will be as gods. Mm-hmm. Why did you begin there?
Well, because I think that this is fundamentally a self-deification movement. And in a way, I wanted to frame it as not something that's just a political movement right now. I think it is sort of the shape-shifting, same ideology presented in a differently packaged way that's been with us since the devil in the garden, controlling that first woman that we may be as gods. And so, there's good news and bad news to that. The good news is that we can see who's behind the mask. And so once we know who really is animating this movement, then, we understand what the stakes are.
Yeah.
The bad news is that it can stop being called woke and can look like something else in 10 years, and it's just going to keep reinventing itself, I think. I think because it's effective. It so effectively targets the human person through the avenue of targeting the family, through targeting the faith, through targeting the moral law. These are things that all are very deeply harmful and destabilizing for people. So I think it's going to keep reinventing itself.
And this is being done and justified by a claim that it's bringing liberty to the captives, that it's reducing oppression, which itself is kind of strange, because if in fact you don't believe that there's any fundamental morality, then why the concern with bringing liberty to the captives? What's that impulse? What are you trying to accomplish there? This is what gets people confused, because you go to a church, a church which is not necessarily a Bible-believing church or a Catholic church, but a church where they're involved in wokeness. They have this kind of ethos there, and they're thinking that they're following Jesus, bringing liberty to the captives. Why? Are they simply unaware of the roots of this movement?
I think oftentimes the good-willed people just haven't read the literature. And so they're so taken by sort of the sloganeering that has claimed the mantle of compassion and love. That the woke movement has done that effectively. The slogans, love is love, love wins, hate has no home here. They've really positioned very strongly to be on the side of love. And for Christians, love is not incidental to our beliefs. It's at the very core. And so I think we've allowed them to define the terms of engagement. And so then a Christian feels like, well, I need to be on the side of compassion. I need to be on the side of love. There are people who are suffering, and I'm called to walk with the marginalized and the suffering. And I don't think that I oftentimes don't think that people understand the depths of what they're embracing, how much poison is part of this movement. And so it might be, that much being persuaded by the culture. Some of it is maybe not enough formation.
Yeah.
I think Christians really need to have good formation in order to identify what's happening and to be able to spot the philosophy behind it. There might be some, it's hard to have courage when there's so many militant voices demanding allegiance to an ideology. And there might be some sinister people in there as well. So I think there's a whole mix of why people adopt the movement.
Okay. I think with the George Floyd situation when he was killed, the reality of Black Lives Matter emerging so powerfully in the culture, immediately, all kinds of people.
Yeah.
You bet Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Let's support Black lives.
Absolutely.
That's what we need to do. And here's a movement that's doing it. It's time that we take another step in supporting, and facing that whole issue. And then all of a sudden, you see on the website of Black Lives Matter is that they stated explicitly want to undermine the nuclear family,
right?
Radical abortion, very strong. All the LGBTQ stuff is all there, and it's like, wow, there's a whole strategy here and a much broader vision. And Black Lives Matter becomes a very strategic moment. This poor man's death becomes a very strategic moment for them to bring a whole lot into the culture.
Yeah.
And people don't, because it's coming with the label Black Lives Matter, people don't want to be found
Right.
resisting it in
Right.
some way.
That's right.
But that was a wake up. You talk about being woke. Getting awake, it's
right.
like, wow, where did all this come from? Kind of thing. Like, there's clear philosophical, political action, cultural, revolutionary ideas that are there that you don't see on the surface initially.
I think that's right. Yeah, and I remember after George Floyd happened, dear friends posting things like, "It's not enough to not be racist; you have to be an anti-racist." And I thought, and I hadn't heard that phrase before. Obviously now I know it's from Kendi, and it's associated with all of this. But at the time, it felt like, well, yeah, that sounds right. And that's the thing that's so confusing. I think is that they're saying things that are literally true.
Sure.
But there's a manipulation behind the meanings of things that you don't really comprehend at first what it is that you're aligning yourself with.
Well, the George Floyd situation is a good example, because the Black Lives Matter movement, which had been around since at least Ferguson and the death of Michael Brown, Black Lives Matter becomes center stage. And what happens is many people begin to say, well, yep, Black Lives Matter, absolutely. All lives matter. But to say all lives matter at that point, this is an interesting point. When you say all lives matter, it becomes a denial of Black Lives Matter, and a lot of people wonder, wait a minute, what's the problem here? Why do I have to say Black Lives Matter, but I can't say all lives matter? Why is all lives matter a negation of Black Lives Matter? What's the dynamic there?
Well, I think that the shift is that we are centering the oppression at the core of the human experience. So rather than same like All Lives Matter is centering the universal brotherhood, sisterhood of men and women, Black Lives Matter is centering oppression at the core. And it's the same reason why at the first Women's March, I don't know if you remember this, there were a group of pro-life feminists who were officially sponsoring the march, and they were told, you can walk with us, but you can't officially have any affiliation with us because you're pro-life. And they were confused and thought, well, we overlap on all of these other areas. We're just pro-life. And I think what they didn't realize that this was not a march for women. This is a march for the political woman, the politicized woman, who understands that at the core, abortion is the sort of sacrament of the fighting against your oppression, including the oppression of your own body, bodily reality. And so I think that's what's happening. Part of what's happening with the BLM statement is that the oppression is the core of the Black experience, and it's more important. It's such a difference from the civil rights of Martin Luther King Jr. when they would say, "I am a man."
Yeah.
I'm not a boy. I'm not a subhuman. They're emphasizing their universal dignity.
Yeah.
Now that's not okay. That's why we can't be colorblind or judged by the content of character. You have to see first and foremost the oppression in the person.
Yeah, this is a very different approach to human dignity and civil rights than we saw in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and into the 60s, which was an attempt on the part of largely Black leaders, Christian leaders, pastors, to get the United States to make good on its promise of, dignity and freedom for all. So Martin Luther King Jr. is saying, "What's wrong with you? I'm one of your kind. Don't you see that? We're together in this." Mm-hmm. And he began having difficulty towards the end of his life because of the rise of the Black Power movement, which was much more in line with what we now call the woke ideology. I want to get to the intellectual history on this too.
Just thinking the same thing.
Yeah,
because it's so interesting.
Before I go there, though, Peter, I wanted to ask: you are aware of what's going on with a lot of Catholic youth, and your wife Debbie works with a great ministry with Catholic girls and young ladies. Mm-hmm. What do you see this wokeness affecting them?
Yeah, I think there's distinctions to be made in terms of what some young people that are from stronger families,
Yeah.
that have support systems and all that, seem to be navigating it pretty well because they can understand it.
Yeah.
But I think many, many young people, just because they're so plugged into the phone every day, they're
Yeah.
plugged into TikTok every day, they're plugged into Instagram and everything, that there's the constant messaging. And I think in the schools, in even Catholic high schools, the battle is on in this area where teachers have said to me in the classroom teaching theology that they're in the position of having to defend and make apology for, create apologetics to counter the argument that young people just have about the time. They're just breathing it in. They accept it. They accept the new values. It's just like when I remember, it made me think when I was a young kid in the 60s, I was just young and my older siblings were there. There was a whole set of values that were coming into our family. Everybody's hair went longer. Everybody, just changed the way we dressed and talked. And there was just this world of ideas that all of a sudden everybody started accepting as normal. Sit-ins happened in the high school and all that kind of stuff. But there's a deeper intensity to it now just because of the incredible shift of the culture, but the way in which the message is constantly being pumped into their minds and hearts through phones, through media, through a culture, and they're being targeted. And what you're mentioning right here about the teachers, how they're hiring teachers in the public school systems today. I mean, it's all there from top to bottom for them. And a lot of times parents are checked out of the real fundamental fight that's going on, and they don't monitor what's happening with their kids and the rest of it, and they just, because they're busy doing life and work and the rest. But so I'd say clearly, we see statistically what's happening with our young people around the country. They're being very confused by this constant obsession to create your own identity, to be a self-creator. It all sounds great, but if you know that, first there's pressure to create yourself, you're this identity that's there, but at the same time, you lay your head on the pillow at night. If you're self-creating, it's made up. If you're making it, you're the one who's making it up, and there's no grounding, there's no reality there, and there's so much insecurity there and so much pressure. So we see this is clearly touching young people all over the place, And so.
Black Lives Matter, I'm going to go there for just a moment,
Yeah.
because again, what happened there is initially after the death of George Floyd, people are saying, of course Black Lives Matter. People began looking at the Black Lives Matter website. It talked about the destruction of the nuclear family. It was a clearly left-wing, celebrated Fidel Castro's birthday. And all of a sudden, what many of us thought was simply a show of solidarity on behalf of George Floyd and oppressed people, we felt like, wait a minute, we're being enlisted in a very well-defined left-wing crusade. So let's talk about the history here. This didn't just happen in the 1960s, and now it reemerges in the 90s and 2000s, 2020s. This goes back to the 19th century. So why don't you lay out some of the intellectual history here? And I think most people won't realize in their own experience, they're not thinking, well, I'm being affected by Karl Marx or George Friedrich Hegel, or that they're not thinking that way. But the point is, there is a history of ideas, and I think it's an important history to keep in mind. So
That's right. No, my co-author Carrie Kresta in Theology Film, she always says women didn't become radical feminists because they were reading Karl Marx and Margaret Sanger. They were reading Cosmopolitan magazine
That's
and
right.
listening to Beyonce.
that is right.
Ideology seeped through popular culture.
Yeah.
So you can. It's always hard to pinpoint when a movement begins because, of course, everyone's fingers influenced by people before. So you can pin it on Rousseau, or I in my book start with Hegel and Marx. The idea being that Hegel, I think of him as being so influential, and he was very influential on Karl Marx. There was a new Hegelian movement that Karl Marx was a part of, and the thing he really seized.
Left-wing Hegelianism is what they call
that's
it.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. And the thing he really gleaned from him was this engine of the dialectic, that society develops itself and progresses itself into an end point of utopian idealism, and that perfecting itself comes through an engine of these three stages that repeat themselves. So there's the status quo, which is the thesis, and that's always going to have internal contradictions within it, and those are called the antithesis. And the working out of that interaction, that conflict, you arrive at a synthesis, which is the result of that conflict. And then that synthesis becomes the new thesis. There will be new contradictions; those have to be worked out. And so through this cycle, you arrive at a totally developed, absolute, zeitgeist mind of society. And Marx applied this strictly to materialism, economic terms. He was an atheist by presumption. He didn't think that he didn't even argue with it. He just thought it was obvious. And he applied to the economic system that the working class, the proletariat, would eventually. There were so many contradictions in the way that the structures of the economy stood, and that they would eventually revolt. That would be an inevitable revolution. Yeah. And he saw the two main obstacles. Well, three actually: private property, the family, and the faith, as the three main obstacles to revolution. I actually oftentimes will say that I think it's the faith, the family, and fatherhood.
Yeah.
And you can understand why, because the faith and the family really give you a personhood. You're named and known in the context of the family. There's a transmission of values that happens in the family. It connects you to a history. Yeah. It roots you in the past. It points you to a purpose. So you have teleology and you have origin. And that really is, revolutionaries really want you to remain in the present, right? And even thinking about when you were talking, Peter, about the way kids are scrolling all the time, there's a rejection of old books, a rejection of our history, a rejection of fundamental teleology that really keeps kids today obsessed and isolated, unmoored utterly. And I think that the family and the faith really do that. So Marx was right to target, I think, those two institutions. Obviously, they also help you to suffer well your circumstances. And no revolution happens from people knowing how to suffer well their circumstances. Yeah. Revolution comes from people enraged by their circumstances.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So there's no cross that you're embracing.
You're
going to be
always
revolutionary.
revolution now.
Yeah. Rub raw the sores of discontent. Yeah. Don't offer it up.
Noelle, can we back up just
Sure.
right into what you're saying? So what would be, in this context, Marx, what was the thesis? What was the antithesis? And what was the synthesis as he saw it precisely? And then what does it look like right now, that dialectic in some way? How that shifted?
I think the thesis he would have said at that time would have been the structure, that the private property, ruling class, proletariat. The antithesis is the fundamental injustice, the fact that that they didn't have a means to ownership. The fundamental injustices in that structure, and the synthesis would be, them rising up, creating a new dictatorship of the proletariat that would eventually work itself into some sort of perfect communism.
The classless society.
The classless society. Yeah. As for now, I think it is just the woke. The thesis now would be that there's still a hegemonic power. That's encapsulated most and embodied most in the white cis straight male. Right. That is the nexus of power. And so the contradictions are all of the oppression that keeps at bay from rising up. And the synthesis would be revolting against it, upending that system, changing our discrimination into that sort of dictatorship of the oppressed.
Yeah. What's always struck me is somewhat strange, and I'm sure people have worked on this and explained it, but Marx seemed to, he had an eschatology. I mean, he had a belief in the future, that history was going somewhere.
Progress, right?
Yeah, and yet he has really no basis for that in his own philosophy. That's simply arbitrary. What he sees as the coming future is not a result of the hand of God. There's no intrinsic meaning to the historical process, and yet he insists that coming down the road is this classless society. I mean, it seems contradictory and hypocritical. Do you know if he was ever called out on that?
I'm not sure, maybe, but I mean, I think that he would probably say that it's a self-creating. He's working towards a self-creating end. So it's not an end that is intrinsic to human nature or intrinsic to there is no stable human nature. If you can re-engineer society only if you believe that we are putty is able to be re-engineered, and that all of the what we think as being things that give meaning to our lives, to our bodies, purposes to our soul, in our souls. These things are all constructed, right? And so. He talked about how the fundamental shift was from seeing God as the sun around whom we revolve to ourselves as our one true sun. And so it's literally a self-deifying movement and self-creating. So I think he's working towards an end, but not an end in a theological sense, like a givenness of an end, but rather towards his own power.
This comes to America through the Frankfurt School, which actually is cultural Marxism. Why don't you just make some of those distinctions for us?
Sure. Yeah. Well, when the revolution, which they were promised was inevitable, didn't happen, there was a group of neo-Marxists and neo-Freudians in Germany who formed an institute called the Institute of Social Research. And they ended up matriculating to the United States in 1935, welcomed by John Dewey to be adjacent to Columbia University.
Most important single philosopher in American history, probably.
John Dewey.
Yeah. Not that I like him, but the point is...
Influential.
Influential. Yeah. He was, I'm trying to recall who it was who called him our Aristotle. Wow. So that gives you some idea of how esteemed he was, at least in some circles.
Yeah, no, they were wildly influential. And there was a lot of figures that come out of the Frankfurt School, probably the most well-known being Herbert Marcuse. Very pivotal figure in the 60s. But there were also people like Wilhelm Reich, who literally wrote what is called the Sexual Revolution. Very distorted history and a personal life, was just sexualized from an early age and had a lot of awful trauma in his family life. And then turned that into this philosophy, basically about sex. That was the animating feature of human
not
person.
To be too miserable about this, but he actually practiced bestiality for a while. I mean, this guy was
very
bad news.
Lots of perversion. Yep. So I talk about several of these figures. A couple of them even went out to California to really start to influence the art world and Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And they were pivotal in helping people to see that art is not for the sake of reflecting what is real or what is beautiful, pointing us to something beautiful, but rather it should be political. All art should point us to a political end, change, action, revolution. And you really see that now. I think even growing up, I absorbed those messages. I thought of a good painting as being something that was sort of political, had a political message behind it. I think it's so common to us now. And movies, if you scan the last Oscar nominees of the last 10 years, they're almost all surrounding some sort of oppression narrative. Some that are valuable and worthwhile and good, but others that are just bizarre. I mean, even The Shape of Water, where it was a woman falling in love with an amphibian, or I don't remember, some animal, a fish or something. But the messages of feminism, the oppressed wife, the mid-century household that was so dark and horrible and oppressive, and certainly lots of movies about the oppression of homosexuals and LGBTQ movement. And then some good movies that have been effective about racism. But the sheer fact of repeating these oppressive narratives over and over, it distorts our ability to understand how much they reflect reality. We start to think that, wow, this is happening everywhere all the time, and how is it happening to me? It really gets into your head in an effective way. So in the mid-'60s, so they came in 1935, but they continued to be powerful. And in the mid-'60s, Herbert Marcuse was really a sort of an intellectual celebrity. He mentored Angela Davis and some of the Weather Underground figures.
The whole student left movement in the 60s. He was the godfather of it.
That's right. So the shift they made was they said, okay, well, the revolution didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? And that's why that was their reason for being, is to analyze why the revolution had not happened and how to seed it in the West.
Why didn't the traditional Marxist idea, why didn't that work? And so they're shifting on now, how do we keep the whole revolution, how can we make the revolution happen, learning from what has failed in the past, which was the middle, people got jobs and things like that, and middle class was created, sort of destroyed it. But is that what you're referring to, basically, when they say, why didn't it work?
Exactly, So they concluded that we have to broaden it. This is not altogether unlike the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci. who also understood that there had to be more of an institutional approach, that there was a perpetuation of power that came through just a hegemonic system that was inherent in all of our institutions. In the Frankfurt School, they really saw that in the West we had an internalized authoritarianism that was manifests itself by things like horrible things like respecting our parents or valuing fatherhood.
Right.
That those things were all signs that you actually had internalized fascism. And so we had to really attack those sorts of instincts in the culture. And so Marcuse was excellent at, or effective at, seeing, okay, what groups can we antagonize? Where can we sow division? Well, there's some racial injustice in this country, so why don't we infiltrate and get into those movements and really mentor them to actually develop a revolutionary mindset? Not the Martin Luther King Jr. mindset that has natural law in it, but rather this other kind. And then he was also really pivotal with, young sort of bohemian student
Right.
culture. They were highly influenced by him. The feminists, Angela Davis was mentored by him, other feminists as well. So he really saw we can create multiple fault lines in society. And through that, we'll more effectively be able to see revolution.
The long march through institutions. What was that phrase about?
That's attributed usually to Gramsci, but I believe it was actually his translator that coined it. So it wasn't altogether dissimilar from what I'm talking about, but it's that he believed that the hegemony, the dominance of society, was in our institutions, our law schools in particular, the academy, our school systems, our art, our popular culture, journalism, and that really what we needed was not a revolution that was going to spill into the streets right away, but rather we needed to start evangelizing in those institutions. We need to infiltrate them with revolutionary thought and seed them. And you can see it's really, even what you were talking about earlier with the teachers, that how they have this metric now to make sure that only politicized teachers can be hired. And you see that in human resources departments and all sorts of things. That they've really effectively institutionalized the woke movement. Not that they were calling it that back then necessarily, but the same ideology has been institutionalized in a way that I think is powerful.
You remember Bill Ayers?
Sure.
Yeah. This was a guy who was part of the Weather Underground. Was involved with blowing up public buildings. His girlfriend, Diane Houghton, blew herself up in putting a bomb together in New York City. He ended up marrying Bernadette Dorn, the leader of the most prominent woman in the whole student left movement. He was a friend of Barack Obama at some point. Can you explain to us how influential this guy was? And he was under the radar. Most of us didn't hear of him until Obama came on the scene.
Yeah, he's a great example of the embodied sort of march through the institutions because he was such a radical, went sort of quiet, and then became a pivotal figure in Chicago at influential teachers college. And that was, of course, a brilliant move, right? If you can train teachers, in effect, they can bring this revolutionary mentality back to their school districts and then spread it there. So it really created a conveyor belt, I think, of activism within education that then is transmitted to, of course, the next generation.
Yeah. This is one of those very influential figures that doesn't get the attention he deserves, I think.
The idea that he was at one point driving curriculum for 35,000 or so teachers all across the United States with the history that he had, the revolutionary history that he actually had. So he had to get help to get there. You know what I mean? So an infrastructure was already built, a pathway for him to be able to get there, and the right people signing on for it to get these ideas into now. Everybody's scratching their heads like, why is this everywhere in our schools? Why is it everywhere in the academy? Because people worked for decades very strategically, very intelligently, and collectively to get us where we are today. And I love the fact of how you're able to dissect this and point to it, because on a surface level, some people just kind of feel like, well, yeah, all the stuff we're drifting into, like all the LGBTQ stuff, the trans stuff, is all this. this is just kind of the natural flow of people getting more aware of people's needs and just loving each other more. And it's something almost like a positive natural flow of history or something. It's progressing and we're waking up. And isn't it wonderful? The arc of history keeps moving us in this way, and it's so amazing. Guess what? We're being moved intelligently, strategically by human beings who want transformation. I was just thinking of, do you remember this story with Mallory Millett talking about her sister Kate Millett?
Yeah, that's a great story. Go ahead, share it with
Kate
us.
Kate wrote the book here, Sexual Politics, in 1970. She was the one assigned in the early feminist movement to get into the institutions and bring this stuff.
Yeah,
so,
she's one of the big four.
Yeah, right.
One of them.
And so her sister Mallory writes this real eye-opening article about her sister after she passed away. And I'll just read what the article said. It said, at the beginning of every meeting, she was talking about Mallory was invited by her sister to come to the meetings of that fundamental core group of women in New York, 7 or 8 key women who ended up building and driving the feminist movement. And she described this way. She said, I was invited to these meetings for consciousness raising, which is very much a Marxist.
Getting woke.
Getting woke. That's
Getting woke,
exactly
that's
what
right.
it is. She was able to come to the woke meeting, in the morning. So it says, it began with a litany of scripted goals and responses, such as, quote, we are here today to make revolution. How? By destroying the family, by destroying the American patriarch, by taking away his power, by destroying monogamy, by promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, and homosexuality. And she said that, it was a shock to her system to enter into it, and they'd shout it out loud, because they understood themselves to be revolutionaries, and you see the very things that they were shouting back in the 70s in their apartment. This small group of women, these things are actually they're now in popular culture.
Yeah.
They're now accepted.
Yeah.
So the revolution is marching on, and so many people are just, besides the fact of being intimidated to try to speak in a moment like this, there's also something inside, I think you were touching on earlier, like we want to help people, and everybody who's driving is defending victims, and it just, something happens inside, like I don't want to oppose this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I want to help. Look at all these people that need help.
And there's a disconnect where I think people don't believe that it's connected to such a sinister movement as what you just read with Kate Millett.
Right.
I'm not exactly sure why. If it's just it just feels too sinister and too far afield, and people aren't willing to understand. But you just want to say, they said that this is what they believe. They said this is what they're going to do. They've been doing it.
And we can trace
and
it.
we can trace it. Yeah.
I think that's the key thing. Most people don't think you can trace it.
Yeah.
So they think we're making kind of general claims about them or they.
Yeah.
And I always say, well, let's make a list. Let's see who are we talking about. And that's why I think the Bill Ayers example is a good one, because here we have somebody whose history we can trace. We can put him in contact with the President of the United States. I mean, I think he came from wealth. I think he was a lot of protection, which you find with a lot of these ideologues. They have wealth behind them, at least in the United States.
Sure. And they understand that actually, politicians have a role. They need to have politicians in the game.
Yeah.
But they understand the under the surface, long game, consistent, strategic movement forward is where the action is. Like real change happens.
Yeah.
Right.
They can't do it alone without politicians making the way here and there. But from their perspective, it's not really about the politicians at the end of the day. You know what I mean? It's about the strategy. It's about what these ladies were doing.
Yeah.
And how the whole thing
Community
unfolded.
organizing.
Yeah, community organizing,
Yeah. The woke is related to becoming awake, which is what often happens when a person has an epiphany, a moment of illumination, a moment of revelation, and they see the world differently. And from that experience, there ends up flowing a set of doctrines or dogmas. And that's true for this movement as well, right? There's a set of beliefs that they have that come out of their moment of epiphany, or whatever you want to call it. You've got them listed in your book. I think it's worthwhile going over them in particular. One of the dogmas is the group is superior to the person.
Yeah.
Can you
Sure.
elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, it's in a proper ordering of group and person. A well-ordered community takes on the good of the individual as the good of the group. Particularly in a family, when you have a child, your child's good becomes your good, and there's a beautiful harmony there. But in the woke movement, the good of the individual is really sublimated to the good of the group being the political advancement of the ideology. So in the example I gave with a women's march, that's a good example of, the pro-life women weren't welcome because it's not enough to be a member of a marginalized class. You have to be a political member. So it's also echoed with Nicole Hannah-Jones, main author of the 1619 Project. She said, "We all know there's a difference between being racially black and being politically black. That it's simply not sufficient to be racially black. You have to have the right consciousness in order to have an authentic black voice. So even authenticity becomes politicized in a couple of different ways."
People might not remember this, but Bill Clinton was called our first black president.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, well, and then Larry Elder was called the black face of white supremacy.
Oh, that's right. That is right.
It's such an effective way to just dismiss any black voice, conservative black voice, traditional black voice, this dismiss them left and right. I mean, if Martin Luther King was alive today, they'd probably dismiss him as well. He's not sufficiently black in the right kind of way because he's not revolutionary in the right kind of way.
In other words, we are not for the empowerment of black people. We're for the empowerment of our political allies.
Another doctrine, will over reason.
Will over reason. So it's most easily encapsulated with it's a term that a lot of people know now called expressive individualism. That the most important thing about the person is what they feel that they are, and that identifying particularly a transgressive identity within ourselves. This was very heavily influenced by Freud. That identifying it within ourselves and then expressing it and living it out in the world is how we also live an authentic life. And so it creates this motivation to be sexually transgressive. So I think, traditionally we would say that will and reason should be in harmony. The life of virtue is our reason identifies what our good is, and then we will it. And then through that habit of life, habit of virtue, our affection grows for the good. We begin to desire the good more naturally. And this sets it apart. It's also connected with the rejection of critical thinking for the sake of critical theory. And I get into that in the book as well. But I think that the expressive individualism is really key. And I think the more sinister part of this second dogma is that it creates an environment that targets innocence in particular. We see this at drag queen story hours and the targeting of children more and more. I think it's not just this bizarre fringe thing. I think it's actually at the core of the movement, is that the innocence of the child is perpetuation of dominance. Because if a child's uncomfortable with a grown man in a miniskirt twerking and dancing in front of him, well, that discomfort means that there's a good that innocence is oriented towards, that it's a signpost to something objective. And so you really have to, if you're woke and you're radicalized properly, you have to understand that it is incumbent on you as a revolutionary to expose children to all sorts of adult fringe sexuality.
I'm sorry, I'm just saying, people may not know about the drag queen story hour. Somebody want to take that up?
Yeah, well, across the country in different places, whether it's in libraries or elementary schools, they're bringing in drag queens, men dressed as women, and doing whatever they do. Sometimes they even do pole dancing and various kinds of things, or they read stories to kids. And again, here's another dynamic. I don't know who the people in charge of the libraries are or the teachers are. They could be people who are really involved in the movement, so to speak, or they just have they feel bad for these people who've been marginalized for so long. And let's bring them in. And maybe it's true that these children are like this person and they're finally going to have, all the stuff that's been put into their head and heart, so they get confused. But those who are driving the movement, this is the insight you gave in the book that I thought was really astounding, was the idea that to believe in the innocence of children in the sexual area and the rest is to perpetuate an idea that morality is objective, that there really is something grounded in reality itself, and they have to blow it up. So they have to say, no, there's no form of sexuality that a child shouldn't be exposed to, or expression of sexuality. The only thing that's preventing us from doing that has been the same old constructs, the same old imposition of somebody else's worldview that's hurting people out there, which I just think it's a really, really important insight. And people, I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this so much is let's get the message out about what's happening, because people who think they're doing a good thing, they don't understand the mindset, the political mindset, the revolutionary mindset that's behind it, that they're trying to attempt, and they're harming these kids. They don't think maybe they're harming them, but they're changing them. They know they're going to change those kids. That's the point.
That's right.
Rather than making room for somebody who's been marginalized or misunderstood. You know?
Yeah, and they sell it on different levels. So the neighborhood librarian might just think this is an anti-bullying effort, sort of along the lines of what you're saying. She doesn't think, they're probably not presenting it to her like, we're going to harm the innocence of children.
Right. Yeah.
They're saying, we don't want children to grow up to be bullies. Compassion, again, claiming the mantle of compassion. And there's always a more radical something happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is interesting, though, to think, too, that it exposes the reality that there are a lot of adults out there in responsible positions who may not be full on with the revolution, but somehow they've lost their own moral sense about protecting children in that, because the ubiquity of the sexual revolution, ubiquity of sexual perversion in the culture, and it's all about people's private, personal decisions and the rest of it. Somehow they're desensitized to having to protect children from this kind of thing. You know what I mean? There's just something's off there at a significant level.
Almost like being put in a cultural trance, right? Like there's a fog of ideology that is very hard to see through. And to wake someone up from that, you almost have to put it really startlingly or blatantly, because we're all so accustomed now that things that would have felt, super shocking 10 years ago now just become normalized. And then it keeps going and going until all of a sudden you're in a place you never thought you would be and accepting things you never thought you would have accepted. But there's a sort of trance, almost like a trance-like state.
It's difficult to identify all the players, but there are players, and that's what we need to keep in mind. We don't necessarily want to claim we know more than we do, but let me give you a quick example here. We've seen this play out in the last 10 years, and you can connect the dots. In June of 2013, the Supreme Court case U.S. v. Windsor struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, and that was the statute that defined marriages for federal purposes as between one man and one woman. You had a year later Time magazine featuring black transgender actress Laverne Cox on its cover. Proclamation was the transgender tipping point, America's next great civil rights frontier. And then, of course, in June of 2015, we had the famous Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court decision, which found that same-sex marriages were protected by the 14th Amendment. That same summer, in fact, within a week, the former Bruce Jenner was splayed out on the cover of Vanity Fair asking everyone to call me Caitlin. And by the end of that year, libraries in California, San Francisco to be specific, were hosting drag queen story hours. Transgenderism is a very different phenomenon than same-sex attraction, okay? But what they share in common is they both are transgressive over historic morality. And Time magazine knew that, and I'll lay any amount of money on it, that there were those in the upper levels of Time's editorial board that decided that they were going to be players in this new revolution.
Yeah.
And think about that. I mean, they actually made a decision. We're going to do this. And we know from studies that have been done of those in the so-called prestige media or the elite media, the mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, we know that they don't share the attitudes of mainstream America. They're different. They're much more to the left. They have much more radical views on abortion. They attend religious services far less frequently than mainstream America. So I think I'd like to have somebody actually tell me what happened. I'd like to know how that decision was made at Time. I'd like to know who decided it. It's that kind of work that will expose these intricate networks, because they are out there.
Yeah.
And it's not enough to say them. We've got to identify them. Yeah.
There's a lot of money behind the transgender movement.
Absolutely.
It did not spring up organically. It's been, I think you're right, a top-down effort. But there is also an internal logic to the ideology that you're also indicating that plays itself out. So there's a couple of different levels. I mean, I remember when gay marriage was legalized, Robert P. George saying, next it's going to become thruples, polyamory, polygamy.
Yeah.
Because if you don't limit marriage by sex, why limit it by number? Right?
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
no real reason.
Then it's
right?
just arbitrary.
You lose
Yeah.
your limiting
Right,
principle,
right,
then
right.
something's so undefined that it can be anything because it's now nothing. Right? There's a meaningless to it. So I think that there's a couple of different layers where I do think there's power and money that's well concealed. I think in some ways probably. There's certain key figures that are probably funding a lot of this, but then it is also the internal logic of the movement.
I think that there's a line you have in the book somewhere, I remember, the next revolution must depose the father. Mm-hmm. The reason I mention this is very much related to this, because all these, the various kinds of expressions of sexuality or whatever, they're all they're attacking the family at some level. I think the deepest battle is, as you were saying at the very beginning of our conversation, is the spiritual battle. Yeah. I was thinking of Our Lady's words to from Sister Lucia, from Fatima, said, the final battle will be over the family.
Yeah.
And you think, just in the back of my mind, I'm just thinking that the underneath this whole conversation is God Himself has created two institutions. Church and family, family first, and then the church. And they know the only way the devil knows the only way the best way to undermine the church is to undermine the family. And the whole movement has this focus of deconstructing the family.
Yeah.
And going after the father, in particular, like, the next revolution must depose the father of the family. And you touch on that. And it's all very much, what's that?
You take out the general, right? Because the fatherhood is incredibly powerful.
It is.
I mean, it maybe sounds platitudinous, but it's true. It is real. And you see that even with the attack on the priesthood, that our spiritual fathers are under great attack. But the father is so effective, such an effective target, I think, because Ingalls would say that all men should learn to become tomcats or licentious. He really wanted to emphasize that men should never be faithful to one woman. And
Men don't really have to learn that.
I know. You give them permission. Then I was like, but you see what happens to the other members of the family. If a woman, then there's an inherent vulnerability to a woman. It's in her body. It's I have had 6 children, and I desperately need my husband during that time because I am laid out. I'm weak. I'm in pain. And I'm recovering. And if a woman doesn't have a man protecting her, then develops a hard shell. She becomes callous to protect that nature that is too vulnerable and valuable to endure the trauma of the sexual revolution. And I think we see that a lot with radical feminism, that women have become very hardened. Mm-hmm. And then for the child becomes rebellious, because the people most incumbent upon to shepherd him morally have lost their moral authority, and so the child is going to become a rebel, and then that seeds more revolution into the movement because they're more easily controlled. Totalitarian ideology always wants to separate child from parent.
Yeah, and I think even well-meaning Catholics, when they look at the battle, they just look at the isolated issue that's on the table, whether it's same-sex marriage or whether it's accepting trans people as they are, instead of understanding that one domino after another is falling, and it's all about deconstructing the family. Yeah. And it pops out every once in a while. Leaders in the movement, like we talked about with Black Lives Matter at the beginning, that's ground zero of the battle, because they know they can't. The revolution isn't going to be able to get where it wants to go unless it does deconstruct that institutional reality called the family. Now, the political drivers of it may not be looking from a spiritual perspective, but from a spiritual perspective, the devil's strategy is to do that very thing.
Yes.
And I think that's why there's a supernatural energy that's involved in all this stuff too, that's escalated, making it so ubiquitous, and it's got so much energy around it, even if it's irrational on certain levels. So it's both a political and a spiritual battle, it seems like.
Well, the irrationality or unreasonableness is actually part of this. I mean, this movement exemplifies the impersonal over the personal. Mm-hmm. It exemplifies the irrational over the rational, and it exemplifies the power hungry over the wise. Mm-hmm. And this is the dynamic of the mob, right?
Yes.
That you describe in the book, and they are interested in the mob. This is something that people wonder, why is it during these riots that people are looting their own neighborhoods? Why are they destroying their own neighborhoods? Well, a lot of times it's actually outsiders coming in to the neighborhood, but often enough there are people from the neighborhood looting their own neighborhood. It's irrational, right? It is irrational. That's the point.
It's chaos.
They want to unleash chaos because chaos is what brings about revolution. And the history of revolution will tell you that you don't know where this is going to go. Those who start revolutions oftentimes don't finish them. They get finished by other agents within the revolution. You saw that with the Bolshevik Revolution. You saw it with the French Revolution. So the unleashing of chaos is part of this, and that is a spiritual battle. Right, going back to the ancient Hebrews and the power that Yahweh exercised over, the sea dragons, those who represented the chaos of the untamed nature. So I think this is not merely a political issue. This is mythic in significance, and I think when I reach this point, I begin to say, okay, what do we do? I mean, what can we do? We, of course, have to maintain our sanity, but what do you propose as a way of fighting back? How do we answer the questions? How do we solve the problems? And how do we shield those who need to be shielded? And how do we stop those people who are actively trying to destroy us? They want to destroy us. They want to destroy our understanding of the world. And frankly, if you look at the history of revolutions, they don't mind destroying you either. This is not a rational movement.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's 3 levels that I usually talk about. First and foremost, it is a spiritual battle. And I think the more I researched it, the more it just became so clear that this is animated by something very demonic. It so effectively targets people and friendship. It eradicates any possibility for real human flourishing. So I think that, people don't like this answer, but truly we need to be saints. We need to be praying. We need to be arming ourselves with the things of God.
And there's a beauty to sanctity. That's what we've forgotten.
It's effective.
Yes.
Effective. People are drawn to it, and it stands so apart from the chaos oftentimes in someone's life that to see something reflects, even in a small glimmer, the nature of our Lord. Yeah. That's a power you can't beat.
Right.
We also have to have a political and practical response. I think, the school board meetings are a good example, shining light on what's animating this movement, helping people to see things differently, helping to wake them up. And then I think we have to be very conscientious about promoting a positive vision of an alternative, because this is a movement that can only destroy, tear down. It doesn't really have a positive vision. In the way, and that's what we're all about as
like
Catholics.
Gnostic. It lives off something else,
Yeah.
and
It's
it
like
is.
a
I was
parasite.
actually going to ask that question of
It's an
okay, they keep
anti-being.
talking about utopia, like they never define what it's going to
When
look
all
like.
the
They just
bad
know how
things
to.
are gone.
They're iconoclastic. They know how to tear everything
That's
down,
right.
but they don't know how to build anything up.
That's right.
You know
That's
what I mean?
right.
Because they're not really grasping who is the human person. What is the human person, and what's true happiness and flourishing and all that kind of stuff. They can't really have an answer to
That's
it.
right. That's right.
So,
On a personal level, I've been playing with this metaphor, and I do a little bit of this in the book. There's this bizarre mental disorder. If you'll indulge me for a minute, I think it's worthwhile. It's called Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
Yeah.
It was popularized in this movie called The Sixth Sense in the late '90s, where this little boy, I see dead people, and he encounters this young girl who has passed away, and she gives him a videotape to present to her father at her wake. And in the videotape, this grieving father watches caught on video his wife poisoning their daughter's food. So that's a mental disorder as a caretaker starts to invent illness in the child, and then oftentimes causes the illness, and sometimes to the point of killing the child. Very disturbing. But I think it's a good analogy on a couple of levels for what we're going through now. For one thing, the caretaker who is actually ill is presented as someone deserving of as a savior, right? And and worthy of compassion, worthy of admiration, because she's been in this horrible situation of having a sick child. But the child is being poisoned.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a good analogy of how we approach as persons other people in this movement. For one thing, the child is the victim, right? So a lot of kids, a lot of young people, their wounds are being exploited, they're being pulled into this movement, they're being confused, and they are being victimized, and they need healing. Mm-hmm. There's also the father. The father would have done anything to have known that he was giving his daughter poison when he carries that tray over, right? Yeah. He's unaware. He needs to be awakened. Mm-hmm. And the mother needs to be stopped. And I think that's the 3 levels of response we need to have by asking the Holy Spirit to help us see what we're dealing with, that some people in the society need healing and compassion.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Some people need to be wake up, gently shake their shoulders. Come on, look what's happening, look what you're doing. And other people who are delivering the poison, they just need to be stopped. And maybe they can be healed after that, but we have to stop the poison drip first.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. That's very good. That's very good. And I do think that having showing a way of life which is practical, to see the beauty that takes place in large families, being able to pass the faith on to the next generation. There's a certain loveliness to this that the world is forgetting. And when they see it, they're kind of stunned by it. Yeah. You know, we've got quite a few grandkids. We get together.
Yeah. With all your musical instruments.
Yeah, we do music together.
Yeah.
We do story. Everybody does something, and it's something which is not often seen in the world. As it's self-evidently beautiful, and it's not often seen. And I think we've got to be willing to, in a way, let our light shine here, and not be intimidated by the world. Parents of large families often tell stories of demeaning remarks that they've received in the grocery store line. Are those all your kids? Well, yeah. Wow, how'd you get so many of them? Well, don't you know how they? But so I do think we have to be really proactive here and recognize that something as domestic, something as properly natural as a family that enjoys one another is a revolutionary act in this day.
And a cross-generational family, you know what I mean?
Yes.
The full picture is very, very powerful, and it's stabilizing. You know, present grandparents bring stability and security. When my mom passed away, and my dad passed away in the late 90s, my mom in the early 2000s, she was 93, and she had 73 children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren.
Beautiful.
That's great.
And at her funeral, the night before the funeral, all the grandkids were there, the great-grandkids and everybody, and popped up, and those who wanted to shared, and I was just amazed at the impact my mother had. Even when she had a walker, my nephews used to say, like, I had one who was a pretty troubled young fellow, and he said, I used to love, and he straightened out, he goes, I used to love going to Grandma's house because, first of all, the food was awesome. He said like that, you know. And then he said, and then we just said, I felt it was so quiet there. And then Grandma would say, okay, Jeremy, it's time to pray the rosary. I'm praying. You want to do it with me? And of course, no one ever says no to Grandma. You know what I mean? Right. And they'd pray, and they just talk about the stability and love. My nieces would say, I felt so loved. I felt so safe there. Yeah. I just felt so loved when I was there. This natural family. So, I mean, I think one of the things that the church, the people of God, need to be armed. We're being undermined right now, and it's, you know, the divisions are happening in the church around some of these issues right now. It's a critical moment, but to arm each believer, you know, with the understanding of a clear biblical worldview and an eternal perspective. Because you look at all the letters of the apostles, or even like the beginning of Book of Revelation, John, the apostles, is in prison on the island of Patmos, and he's writing a letter to 7 churches, and he says, I, John, share with you the tribulation, the kingdom, and the patient endurance. Right. This is Christianity in human history. It will be that way until the Lord comes again.
Right.
Christians are not utopians, right? And we understand that there's a understanding of the world, this good world that God created, and the people in it who God created, who we all love. But there's a fallen dimension of the world, and there's a fallen dimension of humanity.
Yeah.
And to be clear about those kind of things, and the Lord called us out of the world, to be in the world, but not of the world. That is the values. So a lot of people are just absorbing the culture, and they're not clear about that. And they're not clear about the fact that, you know what, this is not my home.
Yeah.
It's not my home. I belong to another. And to the degree that I do that, I find my identity and a community of others who do that. So, I mean, families and the church, we have to strengthen with a biblical worldview, reassert who we are in a way that's inspirational, helpful, practical, and just live it. And then be, one of the titles of Jesus in the book of Revelation is he's the faithful witness. And how does Paul tell us to fight the battle? In Ephesians chapter 6, how to put on the armor of God. And then he says, stand, stand, stand.
Yeah.
Stand on what? It's the only battle you'll ever have. The war's already won. So the only battle that you win by just not quitting.
That's
you
right.
know what I mean?
That's right.
Till the end. And what you do is you bear witness to what I've received. I'm not surprised that the world's in upheaval because I have a biblical worldview. These people are not my enemy. I mean, at one level they are.
Right.
But I'm called to witness the truth to them, and I don't have to worry about my life ultimately. It's in the hands of the Lord. I don't have to worry about the cost or the cancel. You need to be strategic, wise as a serpent, innocent as a dove, but laying hold of the fact that, no, I'm in the hands of the Lord, and this is the very moment I'm called to be a light. Like you're talking about waking. Ephesians says, awake, O sleeper, and arise from the dead. Christ will give you light. Awake, O Catholic or Christian who's not awake to the spiritual battle that's going on there and who you are and your identity and how critical it is to just live family life with all your heart, to give dads a vision of it again. So, I mean, those are the things I think that are missing that leadership in the church, both clergy and laity, needs to help bring people into it so they can get a biblical perspective, a spiritual understanding of what's going on. Then you take up the spiritual weapons more effectively. Now I see what's going on. Now I see how to battle this.
Yeah.
For me to be the kind of dad I'm called to be, to love God with all my heart, to love my wife, to love my kids, to bring them into life in Christ, to bring my neighbors into our family life, all that kind of stuff. And
this is the adventure of discipleship.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. This was the reason why we started Theology of Home, the books and the website and the ministries, just because the simple experience of being invited into the home of a family, when you haven't had that or you've had some harmful version of it, it reaches people in a really deep way that they can't necessarily articulate, but they know they long for it, and it's so immediate. And I think that, oftentimes as Catholics, we can get used to sort of that negative grocery store comment, are these all your kids or what have you? And we start to think, oh gosh, I'm unappealing to the world, or, no one wants to be my friend, or I have to be in a bubble or something. And I think that's a wrong attitude. That we shouldn't have a defensive posture. We should feel confidence that this is what has made me so happy, and this is what people want. And I'm not. I don't want to perform it. I'm not going to be performative, but I'm not going to be afraid to think that people might want to be my friend too, and invite them over for coffee. And you can get people to your house for coffee more easily. Sometimes you can get them to come to mass. But there's still there's a universal language of the home that I think can reach people really deeply.
Tell us a little bit about Theology of Home, the series that you're doing with Carrie Kresta.
With Carrie Kresta, So we knew each other years ago in Steubenville, and we connected later on. And Theology of Home was the first book, came out in 2018. She was running on the treadmill. I was listening to a song about a homecoming, and it just occurred to her that why are we're so compelled by home? We watch all these videos of soldiers returning home, and movies about homecomings, and there's something that's so universally appealing and desirable about it. And of course, it's got a whole host of biblical references and the simple life of the family, and so the idea was just that we can, so much of revolution has been seeded through magazines, movies, television, popular culture, that we need some Catholic media too, that I think sometimes we can be so entranced by ideas, and ideas are hugely important. Philosophy is integral and utterly important. But we also need to create positive visions into the culture and see that through media. And that's a powerful witness.
All that,
So we have 3, Theology of Home 1, 2, and 3, and we have a 4th one coming out this year. And we've got a website where we curate news for women and men, and it's free to subscribe.
Theologyofhome.com?
Yep.
Okay, so
Yeah,
it's
easy to find.
theologyofhome.com. And we'll have all these links available on the website, too, at avemariaradio.net and at Renewal Ministries.
Yep.
We'll have this available, both sites. So, well, let me thank you for taking the time to be with me and Peter. And anything else that you want to conclude with? Anything on your mind that needs to be said that wasn't said?
No, I also just want to thank Noelle for the work you've done here and the clarity of what you're bringing to this battle and doing it in a way that is accessible, really accessible, very clarifying, all kinds of people. Like sometimes you get books written and they're philosophical or looking at the big picture, and people pick them up and they feel intimidated or they just stop. This book, just for any of those who are listening, is just so accessible, and it will help you. It'll help your mind, help you see and understand what's happening. Yeah. And it's a tremendous ministry. We feel very privileged that you're able to be here with us and have this conversation together.
I've been so grateful to get to know you both and to also see all the wonderful work you're doing. So thank you so much. My only parting message would be that it feels like it's an overwhelming battle, but I think we can and should be cheerful warriors in it and have utter confidence. You know, the only thing we should fear is fearing not standing up for Christ. Yeah. And so whatever happens to us for standing up for him, that's not something to fear.
Discipleship is an adventure. It's not routine. It's not mundane. It's not boring. Yeah. It's an adventure.
And the Lord in his wisdom has put us all on earth at this time.
At this time.
Which means all the grace is there for us to be faithful witnesses, and we just need to trust him and turn our hearts to him, pursue it, and get the help and encouragement we need to walk in it. So,
Peter, thanks. Noelle, thanks.
Thanks so much.
I'm Al Kresta.